Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Heron, CEO of the Opera House. Welcome to tonight's Ideas at the House event with Noel Pearson. The Act of Parliament that established the Opera House in 1961, more than a decade before the building opened, spoke of it as a meeting place for matters of national, international and local significance. And there could be no better example of this than Noel Pearson speaking tonight on the subject of race and recognition, about the idea of a more complete Commonwealth. After all, the idea of Bennelong Point as a meeting place for matters of significance wasn't entirely original. The land on which the Opera House stands, the traditional land of the Gadigal people, had already been a meeting place for thousands of years. Our Talks and Ideas programming, which goes from strength to strength each year, is absolutely central to fulfilling that mandate. We take pride in being a place that fosters discussion on the issues and ideas shaping Australian society and culture. Ideas at the House speakers in recent times have included Aung San Suu Kyi, Sir Salman Rushdie, Richard Dawkins, Pussy Riot, and just yesterday, Ariana Huffington. We've held our biggest and best Festival of Dangerous Ideas with almost 25,000 attendances, and we recently passed 1 million views for Ideas at the House on content on YouTube. Last year, we launched a new festival, all about women, and tonight it is my particular pleasure, in addition to welcoming Noel to the stage, to officially announce a new partnership with MH Carnegie & Co. that I know will make a considerable contribution to public debate in this country. Mark Carnegie is a remarkable man. He believes in encouraging public debate about issues that matter. He picks the issues ahead of anyone else, and he has a unique take on everything he does. Under the 3-year partnership, 8 Carnegie Conversations will be curated and produced each year, with leading local and international thinkers discussing key contemporary cultural and social issues. As Mark puts it, we need conversations rather than slanging matches, so that more Australians who really care about our country, who want to be part of coming up with real alternatives to business as usual, can get involved in the debate without having to yell and shout. Thank you so much, Mark. We'll soon be announcing details of the first Carnegie Conversations, and I hope to see many of you there. Now, I'll hand over to our Head of Indigenous Programming, Rhoda Roberts, who'll introduce Noel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louise. Hi everyone, welcome to the Sydney Opera House. As Louise mentioned, my name's Rhoda Roberts. I'm Head of Indigenous Programming at the Sydney Opera House. Got to tell you, it's probably the best job in the world. And it is a wonderful job in this century. We stand on the lands tonight of the Gadigal people. I'm a Bundjalung woman from northern New South Wales. I'm from the Widjabul clan group. And as our protocol deems, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal, but most in particular, I'd like to acknowledge a little bit of history about this site on Jubagali. That was the original name for Bennelong Point. And you all know the story of Bennelong's hut here in front of the northern foyer. Well, back in the days when the frontier war was about to rage, Bennelong used that hut as a war room. He met with a young man from the Barramuta clan called Pemawoy. They had very different opinions about how they would change this nation. Their strategies were important of the day. Bennelong, I guess, was the strategist, whereas Pemawoy possibly had more brawn. And so Bennelong suggested they put a contract out on a young man called John McIntyre who'd caused such grievances to the Gadigals up near where the Sydney Hospital is now based. And so Bennelong employed Pemawoy to take that contract and murder that man and try and change the way they saw the face of this nation. Well, since then, and we do honour them because one of the great things about those two men was it showed us we could have debate, we could be individuals, and we come from very different, diverse communities with very different opinions and views. Those men taught us to have that debate, and it's continued. I can remember growing up when the referendum was occurring and there was talk about the Constitution and what would a change bring to our nation, and what would a change bring to a distinctive culture and language that existed amongst our people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people of this nation. Well, I don't think we could get a better opportunity now with Mr. Noel Pearson being able to write this quarterly essay, Race and Recognition, the Idea of a More Complete Commonwealth. To have this conversation here at the Sydney Opera House shows the commitment of this building and indeed its leaders. We need these conversations across our country. We need to hear the different opinions. I would like to congratulate Anne Mossop, Head of Talks and Ideas here at the House, to enable this opportunity to embed conversations right across the Sydney Opera House. As Noel says, after more than 2 centuries, can a rightful place be found for the original peoples of this land? Well, I know you all want to know. So can you please put your hands together? Mr. Noel Pearson is a lawyer, an activist, the chairman of the Cape York Partnership. He's published so many essays, we couldn't name them all. He's written a book, Up From the Mission, in 2009. And his previous quarterly essay was the acclaimed Radical Hope, Education and Equality in Australia. Following Noel's conversation, we will open for questions, and there are mics placed at either side of the stage that you can come up to just in front of the stage and ask your question. So could you please welcome Mr. Noel Pearson.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Rhoda, for your kind introduction, and thank you to Louise and the Opera House for affording me this privilege. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to say greetings to Indigenous people from Sydney. I bring greetings from Cape York Peninsula. I want to say to Maury and Anna, thank you for your forbearance and patience with me in writing this essay, and to Chris Fake for affording me all of the support that you always do. I want to read from chapters in my essay, but I also just want to talk about some of the background politics leading up to this question of constitutional reform. I read that very excellent essay by Galarrwuy Yunupingu in the Monthly 5 or so years ago, and he goes through the whole history of his political and leadership career, and the Prime Minister stretching back to Billy McMahon right up to Kevin Rudd. And I realised then that, like him, I am putting together a collection of Prime Ministers. But I swear this one is my last one. I first became involved in public life in 1993 with the campaign for the Native Title Act in the wake of the Mabo decision under the Prime Ministership of Paul Keating. And it was during that process that I obviously learned about the whole business of 51% politics. How do you get the good guys to support you, to defend and advocate positions that you want defended? How do you get their support in the Parliament? You need 51% to preserve a decision like Mabo. against a likelihood that a native title might be extinguished and the victory in the High Court might be set aside. So I was a Callow graduate of the University of Sydney Law School when I joined my more esteemed colleagues from the other land councils across Australia when we got involved in the whole business of left to right 51% politics. And I became a pin-up boy for the progressives. It was an easy business, that. You don't have to... it is an easy road being a hero to the left. And I certainly had my share of hero worship. Then in 1998, the Howard government proposed the 10-point plan in response to the Wick decision that we'd been responsible for with the Cape York Land Council. You'll recall that the Wick case was in Cape York Peninsula. It related to a large swathe of land on Western Cape York, including Aboriginal reserve lands, pastoral leases and national parks, and mining leases. And eventually the Wick people succeeded in the High Court, but the Howard government proposed a plan to curtail the rights outlined by the High Court in that decision. So we were involved in a very bitter and long campaign with Indigenous leaders and organisations from around the country, where we sought to mobilise public support once again to defend the rights that had just so recently been won in that case. So it was another kind of exercise in 51% politics, but of course the bad guys were in this time. We were on the 49% side, and thanks to the late Senator Harradine, we remained on the 49% side of that argument. And the 10-point plan prevailed, and the Wick decision was quite substantially trimmed back from the position that the High Court had articulated. It was during that process, and it was over a 2-year period, and I was going to say I've never been so maddened by politics as during that period, but that's not true. But it was a extremely torrid time for all of us that were involved in that campaign, because it was such an unjust thing that the then federal government was doing. But it was during that process, when there was a long stalemate and lots of argument, that the late Ron Caston, QC, the original barrister who took the Mabo case up in the 1980s on behalf of the people of Murray Island, and Ron had become, for me, a great mentor, a great lawyer and a great humanitarian, and I had come into his fellowship in the Melbourne Jewish community. He was, I can still remember his phone number, 9608-7001. It was like every time I called it, he answered. Whatever kind of problems I had, Ron would be at the other end of that phone. Anyway, Ron convened a process that was later dubbed the Bennelong Group. And the idea was that, and Ron's thinking was that we needed to get together a host of conservative leaders from the farming sector, from the National Party, from mining, some of the hardest right-wing characters in politics and business at that time. This was in 1998. And Ron's idea, along with a former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory called Ian Tuxworth, their view was that we could possibly identify some common ground with the far right. And I was sceptical about this idea, but I participated in a process with fellow Indigenous leaders, and we had a series of meetings trying to find some consensus that would preserve the Wick decision, whilst at the same time addressing the concerns of pastoralists and farmers and so on. So I won't say who those figures were that were involved in that process, but they were quite egregious in their orientation. And the interesting thing I learned during that process was that these guys were more decent than the public and we gave them credit for. And it should have been of little surprise to us that people who were probably more acquainted with Aboriginal people than, say, people from Sydney. These were people from out in the sticks, in the regions, in the country towns, who'd known blackfellas all their lives. And when we sat in the room with them and talked to them about a possible way forward, they were unstintingly gracious. And of course, their graciousness increased the more we didn't arrive with a bunch of lefties. It's like they kind of retreated to a certain kind of position when we came at them from the left. Yeah? Of course. If you're going to turn up with a lefty lawyer and they're going to immediately get defensive. So I learned during that 1998 process that, in fact, the things that they were prepared to support, you would not believe. You'd be... and I realised that these two tribes in the whitefellow world that were at each other's throats. And to the extent that we kind of were identified with one of the tribes, we got squashed in between them. And in fact, if we found a way of transcending that polarity, we could discover more support across the spectrum than we had previously ever experienced. That's when I understood about 90% strategies. And so if we plot the whole political and cultural spectrum around the clock, the conviction that I arrived at in 1998, 99 was that we needed to pursue a politics of kind of this side of one nation. He needed to plant a flag with the most decent end of the conservative movement. And if you found common ground with the decent end of the conservative movement, presumably everybody to the left of them should be easier. But of course, so I'm into anti-clockwise political strategies. Because if you go clockwise on the 51% thing, the kind of gear jams at the 51% mark, and you're in trouble when you're only 49%. Of course, the price I've had to pay for pursuing 90% anti-clockwise strategies is that you are no longer a hero to your old friends. They take your pin-up posters off the wall, and the I understood that was the price to pay. I guess I was unnecessarily a bit churlish with them as well. And a bit gratuitous in my criticisms. But they weren't entirely unjustified. I came to really dislike the moral vanity of progressives, and as much as there might have been victimisation by conservatives and the right of Indigenous people, I think more pernicious than victimisation is the people who encourage victimhood. And of course, the progressives were responsible for inculcating a mentality of victimhood. And it was more about assuaging their own view of themselves rather than their perspective on suffering and so on. It's not a debate that I particularly had success with in my tussles with progressives, because the fact that moral vanity is I have very little patience for. I really don't care how people feel about themselves, especially when we turn a blind eye to the suffering of the victimised. I'll make another point, and I've made these points in earlier writings, that my other problem was that that the inculcating this victimhood, you could always it's easy to recognise victimisation, yeah? When the right victimise and vulnerable people, it's easy to recognise. What's hard to recognise is when people nurture a sense of victimhood, because they're on your side. They don't seem to be malign. And it's in fact, at least you get defensive when you hear offence. But when you don't hear offence and it seems to be sympathy, you have no guard against that. And the end result of all of that is that we lose the one power we have in the teeth of discrimination and victimisation. When you encourage victimhood in victims, you deprive them of the one power they have to prevail. And that's why I don't like it. Anyway, 1998 was the time when I completely changed my political thinking. I realised that on some issues we've got to fight 51% battles, and on other issues we've got to pursue 90% strategies. And I became determined that as easy as it was to talk to the town halls in Glebe, and my university days were spent in Balmain, as easy as all of that stuff is, that is not where the work needs to be done. If we're going to talk about the things that we're talking about tonight, we need an approach that sees support across the political spectrum, and to be realistic about the dynamics of how this all works. If we hit this from a 51% clockwise angle, we will end up with 51%, and our referendum plans will fail. We have the hardest constitution in the world to change, a majority of voters in a majority of the states. Only 8 times have there been successful amendments to the Australian Constitution. Once, there was a 65% vote in favour of change, and it didn't get up. 65% of Australians voted in favour of change, but it didn't get up because the magic formula, majority of voters in a majority of the states, wasn't achieved. So not only do we have to pursue 90% strategies, we've got to make sure that we've got a majority of voters in a majority of the states. It's got to work in Western Australia. And we've got to try and win in Tasmania, 2 of the hardest states. And from that moment on, I've been pursuing the long road to China. Because the 90% rule tells us that we need Nixon to go to China. On Indigenous reconciliation and constitutional reform, you need Nixon to propose the reform. It can't be a proposal from the left. Now, this doesn't mean that once a consensus is reached from both sides of politics in relation to the reform proposals, that then they can have it out as much as they like if we have a bipartisan commitment to the reform proposal, but the initiation of the proposal must come from someone like Richard Nixon. That's, to me, just a plain political rule. So I'm very hopeful that the 2 major parties and the minor parties, but particularly the 2 great warring tribes of Australian politics, will reach a bipartisan position in relation to reform proposals, and then they can knock them down, drag them out in relation to their own contests all they like. But what we want from them is a bipartisan commitment to the constitutional referendum. I now want to just talk about, or will actually read from the essay. I'll just read some parts of the essay and maybe tell you my thoughts. So my second chapter in the essay is about history and how we come to terms with it. It's called War of the Worlds. And I start with a quotation from the foreword to the War of the Worlds, which read, "The inspiration for the War of the Worlds came one day when Wells and his brother Frank were strolling through the peaceful countryside in Surrey, south of London. They were discussing the invasion of the Australian island of Tasmania in the early 1800s by European settlers who hunted down and killed most of the primitive people who lived there. To emphasise the reaction of these people, Frank said, "Suppose some beings from another planet were to drop out of the sky suddenly and begin taking over Surrey and then all of England." I came upon this foreword some years ago when sharing an enthusiasm of my youth for H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds with my young son. Even as he makes his way through his own all-consuming passions of boyhood, Thomas, the Crocodile Hunter, Pirates of the Caribbean, Lord of the Rings, Minecraft, and now Harry Potter, I indulge my own nostalgia by sharing those things that possessed me when I was a boy. We've done Richard III, to which we will doubtless return. We've read Charles Portis's masterpiece, True Grit, and watched the original John Wayne film and the Coen brothers remake 100 times. We've acted out the shootout scenes, He's Always Rooster. We're yet to get to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Hound of the Baskervilles. His younger sister and I have started Great Expectations. First turned on by Jeff Wayne's musical version of The War of the Worlds in early high school, aware of Orson Welles' radio hoax, and having read the Welles book, I was stunned to have been unaware of the inspiration for the idea of a Martian invasion of England, its origin in what was called the extirpation of the original Tasmanians. I was disquieted that the source of this extraordinary production in world culture was unknown to me. I knew it was likely unknown to everyone around me and to almost all of my fellow Australians. How come? H.G. Wells knew of the original Tasmanians, but that did not mean he felt empathy for the fate of this inferior race at the hands of the British. Instead, he subscribed to the scientific racism of his era, believing them Paleolithic, and writing, "The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants." In The Last Man, a British genocide in Tasmania, the English historian Tom Lawson shows how the destruction of the Tasmanians played out in British culture. We will return to Lawson's contribution to the debate on genocide in Tasmania soon, after we lift the scales from our eyes concerning some of the most revered figures of that culture in the 19th century. The novelist Anthony Trollope, in his emigration guide, Australia and New Zealand, demanded his British readers squarely face the fact that colonisation involved the theft of land and the destruction of its original owners, which fact was not morally wrong, but an advancement of civilisation. Lawson writes that Trollope cannot be taken as other than calling for genocide when he wrote, "Of the Australian black man we may say certainly that he has to go. That he should perish without unnecessary suffering should be the aim of all who are concerned in this matter." Charles Darwin, the century's greatest scientist, whom Lawson calls a self-conscious liberal humanitarian, while opposing polygenist theories that various races were distinct species, nevertheless proposed culture as the basis of inferiority and superiority. Lawson, Indigenous Tasmanians in Darwin's formulation had been swept aside by a more culturally developed, more civilized people. Lawson writes, "The descent of man was Darwin's answer to that new political context, in which he asserted that while biologically the human race was singular, there were in effect cultural differences that allowed for some form of racial hierarchy. The Tasmanians appeared at the bottom of this hierarchy." Darwin wrote, "When civilized nations come into contact with barbarians, the struggle is short. Of the causes which lead to the victory of civilized nations, some are plain and simple, others complex and obscure. We can see that the cultivation of the land be fatal in many ways to savages, for they cannot or will not change their habits. I expected Charles Darwin, but I didn't expect Charles Dickens. Of the century's greatest English novelist, the author of Great Expectations and an Immortal Canon, Lawson writes, Dickens famously attacked the humanitarian idealisation of the noble savage in June 1853 in a furious denunciation that amounts, to use modern-day language, to a call for genocide. Dickens wrote, "I call him a savage, and I call a savage something highly desirable to be civilised off the face of the earth. My position is that if we have anything to learn from the noble savage, it is what to avoid. His virtues are a fable. His happiness is a delusion. His nobility, nonsense. We have no greater justification for being cruel to the miserable object than for being cruel to a William Shakespeare or an Isaac Newton. But he passes away before an immeasurably better and higher power than ever ran wild in any earthly woods. And the world will be all the better when his place knows him no more." I am yet to work out whether, how, and when to tell my girl that the creator of Pip, Pumblechook, and that convict wretch Magwitch may have wished her namesake great-great-grandmother off the face of the earth. Ironically, when one's identification with the magnificent literary treasures of England turns out so, there is a Dickensian pathos to the crestfallen scene. One is acutely conscious of what Robert Hughes called anachronistic moralising, but the bridge between our contemporary values and those of Dickens' time should surely be a universal and timeless humanity, but alas not. I don't know whether it is hard for all Aborigines, but it certainly is for me to read this history with a historian's dispassionate objectivity and without the emotional convulsions of identification and memory. As a child, I loved my mother's mother most in the world. Her humour, generosity, and ill temper I often detect in myself and in the various countenances of my children. An irascible, pipe-smoking, bush-born lady, she bustled with her portmanteau on perambulations to her numerous grandchildren growing up in the Daintree and Bloomfield missions and the Hopevale mission of my childhood. She could have been Truganini, but less travelled, and from a smaller rainforest world than the 19th century Tasmanian, whose passing in 1876 was a world historical event. marking the assumed extinction of a race. It was a reverberation I would feel when I learnt her name in primary school and the awful meaning of her distinction. How many Australians born in the 138 years since Truganini's death learnt her legend and scarcely thought deeper about the enormity of the loss she represented and the history that led to it. Her spirit casts a long shadow over Australian history, but we have nearly all of us found a way to avert our eyes from its meaning. That small item in the primary school curriculum of my childhood would have been learnt by all my generation. Maybe it wasn't a formal part of any syllabus, but it was one of those salient facts of Australian society that every child absorbed, like Don Bradman's batting average and Phar Lap's outsized heart. It would have been learnt by John Howard and Paul Keating, by Gough Whitlam and Robert Menzies. I don't know if they teach kids about Truganini today. As a student of history but not a historian, I am as well read as many, but I too have skirted this history. Learning later in life of the descendants of the original Tasmanians and the offence of the assumption of extinction seemed to lessen the imperative to face the question of Truganini's moral legacy. Maybe the scale of the horror diminished as the country accepted the fact of the continued survival of Tasmania's Aboriginal community. But surely the fact of the descendants' survival does not in any way alter or diminish the profundity of what happened to their ancestors. In his 1968 Boyer lecture, W.E.H. Stanner spoke of the great Australian silence. Inattention on such a scale, he wrote, cannot possibly be explained by absent-mindedness. It is a structural matter, a view from a window which has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of the landscape. What may have begun as a simple forgetting of other possible views turned under habit and over time into something like a cult of forgetfulness practiced on a national scale. We have been able for so long to disremember the Aborigines that we are now hard put to keep them in mind even when we most want to do so. This excluded quadrant of the landscape was not just a national phenomenon, it was a personal one. Forgetfulness was not just a cult, it was resorted to by individual Australians, descendants of both the invading Europeans and the Aborigines. Australians who, like me, struggle to work out how we might deal with the past. I want to read a piece in relation to layered identities and my thoughts about fundamentalism and orthodoxy. So my idea of layered identities is an idea I put forward years ago, that the idea of the melting pot or the patchwork quilt are inadequate metaphors for explaining the layers of identity we all have. Yeah, I'm an Australian, but I'm a Queenslander, and I'm a North Queenslander, and I'm a Cape Yorker, and I'm a Lutheran, and I'm a Noel Pearson, but I'm from Bakarmoko. We all have these layers of, I'm part of the great rugby nation. We all have these layers of identification, and Amartya Sen said that The great problem is that when we essentialize and we reduce ourselves down to a singular identity of either religion or culture and so on, and we don't realize that nurturing all of the layers of our identity produces a warp and a weave to the national fabric that is very good for coexistence and unity. So I propose the idea of layered identities as crucial to successful commonwealths. But identity fundamentalism is the enemy of commonwealths. When individuals and groups elevate one layer of their identity to the exclusion of all others, then we have a problem. Such chauvinism can arise at the level of subgroups and at the national level. While fundamentalism is a problem, orthodoxy is not. Nations such as Australia have Orthodox Christian, Jewish and Islamic communities, without this being inconsistent with multicultural harmony. Political and cultural conservatives play the role of upholding the country's Anglo culture and inheritance. Like their non-Anglo counterparts, the conservatives of Quadrant and the Samuel Griffith Society are a minority, but they uphold traditions that serve society as a whole. Without a core of orthodox conservatives, modern societies would descend into a soulless cosmopolitanism. Conservatism respects memory, tradition, ritual, and values that we have inherited over and above an enthusiasm for the future and an indulgence in the present. T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, in 1921, captured the vital presence of tradition in the contemporary productions of European artists. He wrote, "He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate Shakespeare, or Homer, or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did, precisely, and they are that which we know." But orthodoxy that reduces to fundamentalism is not conservatism. True conservatism equips societies and peoples to contend with the modern world and change. It is not obscurant to the changing world. Conservatism understands that fundamentalism is antipathetic to the Commonwealth. Galarrwuy Yunupingu is an Australian conservative, and he desires to hold on to things older than Homer and the Bible. Where would we be without Homer and the Old Testament? Don Watson asked in a February 2014 essay in the Monthly. I think this is what Yunupingu means when he says of the song cycles of his culture, "My inner life is that of the Yolngu song cycles, the ceremonies, the knowledge, the law and the land. This is Yothu Yindi, balance, wholeness, completeness." Yunupingu's question, equivalent to Watson's, is, where would my people be without the Yolngu song cycles? This question sits within a larger question. Where would Aboriginal Australians be without the song cycles of Aboriginal Australia? And this question, in turn, sits within the largest question. Where would Australia and Australians be without the song cycles of Aboriginal Australia? I also want to talk about my metaphor for the Commonwealth and what I call our triune nation. It's an extract from a speech I gave at the 50th anniversary of the Australian newspaper. I say in the essay that it was for me a signal event. I tell this story to give a full context to my remarks to that audience, in which I set out how constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians would allow the nation to reveal our true nature and the great hidden architecture of our Commonwealth. I said, our nation is in three parts. There is our ancient heritage, written in the continent, and the original culture painted on its land and seascapes. There is its British inheritance, the structures of government and society transported from the United Kingdom, fixing its foundations in the ancient soil. There is its multicultural achievement, a triumph of immigration that brought together the gifts of peoples and cultures from all over the globe, forming one indissoluble Commonwealth. We stand on the cusp of bringing these three parts of our national story together: our ancient heritage, our British inheritance, and our multicultural triumph, with constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. This reconciliation will make a more complete Commonwealth. The colonial history, which I've revisited in this essay, is the reason why the relationship between our Indigenous heritage and the country's British heritage has eluded us. As troubled as this history is, and as troubling as it will be for the foreseeable future, these two things are the heritage of Australia. There is no denying it. It is the reality and it is the truth. No matter how much white Australians might want to ignore it, or black Australians might want to reject it, whatever the mutual denial of the past, the future must be one of mutual recognition. And finally, I just want to riff about oikophilia. And it's Roger Scruton's fascinating idea in his recent book, Green Philosophy, How to Think Seriously About the Planet. And I open with a quote from his book where he says that Edmund Burke developed three ideas that it seemed to me were then and ought to be now the core of conservative thinking: respect for the dead, the little platoon, and the voice of tradition. Burke was one of the first major political thinkers to place future generations at the heart of politics. Burke's view of society as an association of the dead, the living and the unborn, carries a precious hint as to how the responsibility for future generations arises. It arises from love, and love directed towards what is unknown must arise from what is known. But the future is not known, nor are the people who will inhabit it, but the past is known. And the dead, our dead, are still the objects of love and veneration. It is by expending on them some part of our care, Burke believed, that we care also for the unborn. For we plant in our hearts the transgenerational view of society that is the best guarantee that we will moderate our present appetites in the interests of those who are yet to be. So love of home, oikophilia, is the intriguing idea put forward by the English philosopher Roger Scruton. It is, I think, a most important contribution to how the pressing environmental problems facing human societies might be thought about and responded to. Scruton's book brings together the conservation latent in political conservatism and the conservatism latent in environmental conservation. Love of the oikos, or household, is the common motivation in the stewardship and protection of environment and society. This common motive is for Scruton natural, the shared love of place. He writes, that, it seems to me, is the goal towards which serious environmentalism and serious conservatism both point, namely home, the place where we are and that we share, the place that defines us, that we hold in trust for our descendants and that we don't want to spoil. It is time to take a more open-minded and imaginative vision of what conservatism and environmentalism have to offer each other. For nobody seems to have identified a motive more likely to serve the environmental cause than this one, of the shared love of our home. It is a motive in ordinary people. It can provide a foundation both for a conservative approach to institutions and a conservationist approach to the land. It is a motive that might permit us to reconcile the demand for democratic participation with the respect for future generations and the duty of trusteeship. It is, in my view, the only serious resource that we have in our fight to maintain local order in the face of globally stimulated decay. I write, environmentalists staring at the stark and impenetrable wall of liberal self-interest, frustrating their schemes to turn around environmental decay, should read Scruton and pause to reflect on where the mobilising of imposed large-scale bureaucratic strategies against the self-interest of Homo economicus has ended up. Put aside your fantasies of eco-revolution and the great green Uber Internationale. Scruton proposes another motive, potentially as compelling as self-interest, the natural love of home. I go on to talk about the relevance of Scruton's ideas for the indigenous concept of homeland in the following manner. I want to now discuss one aspect of Scruton's idea of conservatism, respect for and connection with the dead, as part of a consideration of what it means to be indigenous. In this passage from the International Court of Justice's 1975 Western Sahara case, Judge Amoun captured what lies at the core of the idea of peoples being indigenous to a territory. He said, Mr. Bayana Baimea goes on to dismiss the materialistic concept of terra nullius, which led to this dismemberment of Africa following the Berlin Conference of 1885. He substitutes for this a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the man who was born therefrom remains attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with his ancestors. This link is the basis of ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. I write, I am not now concerned with the legal question. I'm concerned with the metaphysical question, the spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land and the man who was born therefrom, who remains attached thereto, and who must one day return thither to be united with his ancestors. This is it. This is the nub. This is the essence. This is the source. Because before we have the abstractions of law, we have things that are real. The law is not the origin. It is the ancestral bones in the land that is the source. It is the dust of the ancestors mixed with the dust of the land. It is from that land and dust that the people of the present came. And it is to that same dust and land that they remain attached. And it is to the same land that they will one day return to be united with their ancestors. At the core of all Aboriginal customary law, you find these elements. The ancestral tie to the land, the person born from that land, who remains attached to the land and whose spirits will one day return to that land. I would venture to say that these ideas are universal to all Indigenous conceptions of relationship to their country the world over. My point is that it is not the law that is the wellspring of indigeneity, it is a reality concerning the dead, the living and the people to come, and the country to which they are tied. It is a similar reality of which Scruton writes when he refers to Burke's view of society as an association of the dead, the living, and the unborn. If Burke's association is real, then it is real in the sense captured in Judge Amoon's most apposite definition. On this interpretation, it is theoretically possible to take Andrew Bolt seriously when he protests that he too is Indigenous to this country. The bones and dust of his ancestors and all settler and immigrant Australians who made this continent their home have been accumulating and mixing with the ancient soil for 226 years. Aboriginal laws and customs recognise the connections that arise from places of birth and burial. In a real sense, the Bolts are becoming Indigenous to Australia. Perhaps he could recognise in turn that the bones of Gullalwur Yunupingu's ancestors have been returning for millennia to the lands from which they arose. Thank you.
Well, you took us on quite a swing there, but I want to go back to, I love the fact that you mentioned your children. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of in you that often people don't see. They see you as this Aboriginal leader. They read the papers. And more recently, because there are very few people that have gone, I guess, through your experiences, Noel, particularly of the last decade. And Rachel Perkins responded quite eloquently recently to an article that was written, and she used her father as a great example. And she made one comment in there that when, and I'm sure I actually did it last night when I was watching Living with the Enemy, but she said that when there was an election and the budget would come on, that the small appliances across their household would be thrown across the room. And I thought that was very interesting. And we don't often see that side of, she knows what it's like to live with a person who has a passion and a fire and a belief but at the same time it's not easy. And when your own people question your very motive, it can at times be devastating. And that, of course, has happened to you quite often. So what do? Throw small appliances?
Last time I was in town, I was trending on Twitter.
You need to put that hat on.
Yeah, I think that I yearn for the time when it becomes easier for Aboriginal children of the future to not have to be activists. My greatest fear for my own children is that they will be bequeathed a horrific mantle. It should be possible for them to make choices in life that are in accord with their own passions and interests rather than burden. My father cursed me. He didn't know it, but he said the purpose of life was to serve God and serve your fellow man. And that has been a terrible weight in my life, because you cannot escape duty. And I think I can completely understand the difficulty of our current predicament, but perhaps my hope is that at some point down the track, young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will be like other Australians in choosing to pursue their own passions and interests rather than labouring under some burden of duty. I think people get nothing we have ever achieved in our work in Cape York Peninsula has come without a fight. We might look like serene, zen-like ducks on the surface.
I don't think you've ever looked like that, Dale.
But everything, when you're 3% of the country, it only takes the structures within which you have to try to prevail to be 5% against you, yeah? You add up 5% with the nation of millions that you face, it adds up to an insuperable wall. And no progress we have ever made in our work in Cape York has come about easily. It has been a knock 'em down, drag 'em out fight in more cases than not. And the problem is that the wins you have to have are, you need more wins than the wins we get. The wins have to come naturally and ordinarily, but instead the wins we have are very hard won.
And I guess we're very different if you were to look at international First Nations communities, in that we are that minority status.
So my essay talks about that. I think the numbers are absolutely crucial to understanding our situation. The fact of our extreme minority status means that even if we were overrepresented in the bureaucracy or in the judiciary or in politics, we would still not have the answers. Yeah? But we're underrepresented. And it's a function of our extreme minority status, and the Australian democracy does not take into account the egregious nature of our minority status. The democracy doesn't work for us. The democracy doesn't respond to us. People think, oh, they see Noel Pearson or Patrick Dodson or Marcia Langton and Charlie Perkins and, they think we wield some power in the joint. And it is completely out of disproportion to the reality. I think Australians have a very incorrect understanding of the torment of powerlessness that Bill Stanner wrote about, 50 years ago. And it is still a defining feature of our place in this country.
I know there's quite a few of you out there that want to ask questions. We've got the mics. I'm just trying to see where they are. They're on the level there. You'll see the lights up there. Does anyone have a question for Mr. Noel Pearson? Can you make your way just up behind you to the mic? It's just 2 steps up, yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Pearson, thank you so much for your address tonight. I'm very interested in the Recognise campaign and the desire to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. And I heard you on the radio this morning talking about the need for that to go beyond symbolism. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more on what you mean by that and how that can be achieved without losing the idea of a successful referendum.
Yeah, I think the history of discrimination that Indigenous people have experienced, we need a new guarantee for the future. And one of the central debating points in relation to the referendum will be around the question of whether there should be a guarantee against non-discrimination in the Constitution. It is probably the biggest impediment to consensus on this referendum. The Conservatives have an implacable opposition to the idea of putting a guarantee against racial non-discrimination in the Constitution. And at the time that myself and my colleagues were on the expert panel and we proposed a non-discrimination provision in the Constitution, I had little understanding of the nature of the Conservative objection and how deeply held it is. Over the last 2 years, I've deliberately set out to understand what that objection is. This refusal to submit to judges deciding what is right or wrong, and their concern that by giving the High Court a supervisory power in relation to discrimination derogates from the supremacy of Parliament. That's their position. So I really think that this is going to be the big contest. The Conservative objection to the guarantee against discrimination and those who, like me, have been proposing a provision of great importance like that. I think there is a middle position, or at least a third position, which doesn't represent a weak compromise. So my proposition to the Conservatives is to say, we understand your objection in principle to having a provision like that in the Constitution, and for the reasons that you give, but what about the Indigenous concern about the way we have been treated in the past, and that we don't want that treatment to continue in the future? What is the better solution? And so what I think the better solution is that we should have a say in relation to the laws and policies that apply to us. If judges are the wrong people to decide this question, well, then the right people to decide it should be us. And so in the essay I suggest that perhaps there has to be constitutional provision for Indigenous people to be part of the parliamentary process in relation to those laws and policies that apply to our futures. In other words, we've got to address the democratic problem here. Indigenous Australians are affected by a whole lot of laws and policies over which we have no say. And the democratic procedures of the nation don't make provision for us to have a say. And so I think this is going to be this is a substantive question. It's an extremely important question, and it goes to this question about power, democratic power. Is the 3% mouse going to have some standing in the democracy, particularly when it concerns when Parliament legislates in respect of the interests of that 3%?
Mr. Pearson, I'm a white Australian. I live in the eastern suburbs. I work full-time and I'm very much on your side. I'd just like to know what I can do in my busy life to help the cause.
Well, I think that, you know, when I say that some of us got to go hunting at the 90% mark, I don't mean to say that all of us are going to be hunting somewhere. We need some people rounding up the left, and we need some people rounding up the middle, and we need some people rounding up the doctors' wives, and we need, you know, we need the whole lot, yeah? And it's important work. It's just that I get the easy part. But I think a successful referendum is going to require everybody to work across the whole spectrum and to enjoin Australians to the idea that this is something that we need to do. And one of the most compelling things I read that I actually don't talk about in the essay, but was a statement from the historian Bain Attwood. He says that you know, recognition is a mirror. When white Australians recognise Indigenous Australians, they in turn will be recognised. And I thought that's a very powerful idea that Bain Attwood makes, and we need to enjoin the entire country in this referendum. Because it is a referendum not just about the recognition of Indigenous Australians, it is a mutual recognition.
Oh, hello, Noel. My name's Mike Butler. Over this way. My name's Mike Butler and I'm from regional Queensland. Yeah. And like many families in regional Queensland, my family has a secret, and the secret was that we've got Indigenous blood in us. I'm the first one to recognise that, and I'm of the belief that you've got the stolen generation, but then there was another generation that was Anglo families that had Aboriginal people come into the family, and they basically rubbed that out as much as possible on all sort of official documentation where they could. My question to you is, do you think I am alone in this, or do you think there's a significant proportion of people like me? Because I've been brought up white, and I'm the first person in my family to recognise and represent my indigeneity. What do you see as people like in my position, what our role is with reconciliation, and whether we have a role at all?
Gee.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that, but...
All I can say is that I would urge the idea that we all have layers, and every individual has a multitude of identities that we connect with. And you are absolutely, from the North Queensland I know heaps of white fellas with Aboriginal ancestry. Australia's jam-packed with people like you.
Yeah, there's more. There's a lot of us.
Yeah, and how various people choose to identify and so on. I like Amartya Sen's idea that there's no need to essentialise your identity. You connect at a certain layer with a whole lot of other Australians, but on another layer you connect with a different group and so on. I really urge the idea of layers, and of course some layers are more important than others. Your football layer is more important than religion or something, but I see that this will increasingly be the case. The multiple identities of Australians going forward is going to increase, not decrease.
Yeah. Look, just pushing on from that, the concept of Aboriginal sovereignty, do you think that's a dangerous thing, by placing Indigenous people and giving them separate rights to the rest of the population?
Well, the quotation that I alluded to in my essay and in my extract from the essay earlier gives a definition of sovereignty relating to ancestral connection with the land. There's also definitions at law in international legal theory about sovereignty inhering in nations. There is a very live argument, and has long been a live argument, in relation to what has become of the original sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, because the British annexation treats the legality of that acquisition of sovereignty as something that is injusticiable. It can't be challenged. And while all the circumstances seem to point to the illegality of the original acquisition, the likelihood of this question ever being legally determined is zero, in my view. So a real historical question about the legality of the original usurpation of the sovereignty of the original peoples is something that is going to lie unresolved. I wouldn't say that the making of that argument is a dangerous argument. I just think that it is it is a question that I can see no legal or political avenue open to it.
We've probably got time for just a couple more questions. And in northern New South Wales, there's probably 30,000 like you, Mr. Butler. So, because those white women weren't out there in those early days. So we lied back and thought of England. No. Yes.
Hi, my name's Tara. I'm a 15-year-old school student and recently just found out that I do have Indigenous heritage as well. So, yeah, you're not alone. I was just wondering, what role do you see the youth of Australia, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, playing in reaching proper recognition of Indigenous Australians?
Yeah. No, I think that my hope is that the privilege of being Australian is going to be better understood by Australians in the future. And that privilege is that I think you have the heritage of 53,000 plus years as part of your heritage. And you have the British inheritance as well. I think young Australians are extraordinarily privileged in that respect. You are at least bicultural, if not multicultural. And I see young Australians of the future embracing their Indigenous heritage, as that'll be the day when we become a complete Commonwealth, I think. The day when we're able to reconcile and pull together those three parts that make our nation. My hope for the future is that, young white Australians are going to be speakers of the original languages of this continent. My own language, Guguyimir, is spoken by about 1,000 people. It's right on the edge. If we don't, if our efforts at keeping that language going, a language that has been on this continent for millennia, it will pass from the earth. And so I'd love to see the day when a bigger speech community joins the Guguyimir in keeping that language alive. I keep going on about the Lutherans, but our brethren in the church should be the speakers of Guguyimir. We are connected with thousands of people in the history of our mission. And those young Australians who are connected with us historically and spiritually, they ought to be part of our Guguyimir nation. We consider them as such. When the grandchildren of the missionaries come back to Hopevale, they may as well be kin returning. And so I think the Australia of the future, if we do this recognition right, will be a future where the great privilege of being Australian will be understood by Australians. And we will embrace the languages, we will embrace the land, and we will embrace the culture that is so rich and so much a part of our national heritage. I get tremendously inspired when I go to New Zealand, and it is a great inspiration for us Australians if we if we look to the example across the Tasman, because they really, you know, it's just a splendid thing the way the way they're building a bicultural society, and I think that is open to us.
So we've got time just for 2 more questions. There's one on either side, so we'll go to our side over here, and then just one more question. We'll have to wrap it up.
Okay. Hello, Noel. Thanks for being here. My name's Brenda. I'm 69 now, so I've just allowed myself to retire, which is why I'm able to be here. But when I was growing up in Sydney, I had very little idea, and certainly am not aware of ever meeting or knowing of any Aborigines. Okay, and I certainly didn't learn about them at school. Then when I was doing my paediatric training in Brisbane, I met up with a nurse that came from Mareeba in Queensland. And she obviously was very, very racist and told me some dreadful stories of what she thought of and what the Aborigines were like up in Mareeba, which absolutely horrified me. And not long after that, we had the big conversion of Aboriginal people into Bjelke Peterson's Brisbane. I think it was the Commonwealth Games, was it? Yeah.
Yes.
And listening to all of that and thinking, I need to learn some more, I decided that I would go bush, and I went and joined the South Australian Health Commission and worked at Ernabella on the Pitjantjatjara lands. And my mentor back in those days was Yami Lester, and he taught me Aboriginal contact history. And I have to say that at the time I was absolutely horrified, ashamed, furiously annoyed that my education, and I was in my 30s at that point in time, I hadn't learned any of that. Really, really furious. So then over the years, I finally went to Darwin. I worked at lots of Aboriginal communities around the Northern Territory. And of course I was there when the intervention came in. And again, all the dreadful things were happening and what was happening to those people around all of that. One of the things all through my working life when I was working with Indigenous communities, and I'd come back out and I'd be talking to people about it, people don't know, white fellas just don't know. Is there anything being done in getting Aboriginal contact history into our schools? Because we can't blame white fellas.
Well, you know what?
Learn.
You can come to the Opera House and see lots of programming, and particularly next year,
I know, but
we have quite a number of that.
Yes, I know. But
did you have a question for Noel?
Yes, I have. What are we doing about getting Aboriginal contact history into the schools around Australia? Not just in Sydney or not just in certain little places, but all around Australia. Why Aboriginal people aren't coming into the schools and teaching Aboriginal history?
Yeah. Well, not enough is being done, obviously.
No.
And I really struggled with this essay writing about Tasmania and my own feelings about what happened down there. I struggled mainly because I really feared that I was kind of going against my political strategy. You know, I'm trying to win people over, and I'm talking about some bracing questions. I was quite paralysed in relation to that whole question, because I just think we're very, and I say this as an Aboriginal person as well, that you know it's just so much easier in this country to not talk about it.
But we can't deny the truth, can we? We have to know.
And
people have a right to know.
And so facing up to the truths of the past and working out how we deal with it is a national challenge, I think. You know, how we contend with history is is for Australians, I think, one of our biggest challenges.
Thank you. And just our last question, thanks.
Nice to see you again, Noel. We shared a platform it's Sean Klutzwing. We shared a platform in, I think, about 1995 at Trinity Grammar in Canberra.
Yes.
I've got older, you've got thinner. But you're looking terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
And I just really wanted to say that I'm a little bit on the left.
Yeah.
My book, Marbo, A Symbol of Sharing, I'm in the process of revising it.
For sure.
I looked at it the other day, and you enjoy the first quotation in the book.
Okay.
I've read about you recently. I also read Rachel Perkins' piece, and I've added a paragraph to my book. You remain the first quote, but I later on quote Charlie when I've written about the appalling treatment of the blacks in West Australia under the new government. And the quote from Charlie is, "Mongrel bastards."
Yeah.
And that'll be in the new edition. But my question to you is the left able to muck up this referendum?
Okay. No,
sorry, I should say that mongrel bastards is directed at the politicians and the bureaucracies. I hope that wasn't misunderstood.
No. I had this wonderful principal when I was in primary school who thrust into my hands Charlie's biography, A Bastard Like Me. I was 10 years old and I was completely galvanised by this book. And I had the great privilege of working with him and becoming a friend of Charlie's. I never really appreciated the enormity of his contribution to our people until his late in his life. But he was a predecessor of mine at Sydney University, and much more illustrious than I ever was when I skulked around that place. But I have to say that in relation to the question you ask about the left, I don't think so. I think that the left can and will play a constructive role in this referendum. I think some of the shifts that have taken place in relation to these questions, it took a long time for Labor to understand our critique of welfare and everything else. It was not a easy thing for them to take on board, the fact that we could be so vehemently in favour of land rights but so determined to tackle welfare, because they were supposed to be opposite things. And but I think the left have largely made the journey, and they see that land rights and tackling passivity and dependency are in fact part of the same agenda, that human rights and economic development are actually should be complementary agendas. So I don't have the fear that the left will bugger this up. I think it behoves the leaders of the left and the thinkers of the left, though, to make sure that we keep an eye on the prize rather than an eye on advantage over our opponents or whatever. That's going to be the test for both sides, but particularly for those who nominally should be the ones that are coming at this with a native kind of affinity with the issue, you know. And so I'm not as I think that both sides are going to be constructive in this thing.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us with this address of Mr. Noel Pearson. Of course, as I mentioned, the quarterly will be outside, and Noel is going to sign some copies when you go out. It's been wonderful having you, Noel.
Thank you, Rhona.
And I urge you to read this, because I've read I haven't read it all. Oh my God. I had to keep a dictionary beside me because... And I learnt a wonderful thing. Charnel House, is it? A Charnel House. Does anyone know what that is? Well, I do now. House of Death. And it's amazing in the context. So not only did I start to read this, I had a wonderful history lesson. I learned a bit more of English. And I wrote a lot of notes, and it kept me guessing. So I thank you, because I don't know about all you lot, but I'm going away thinking deeper, thinking about the complexities, and wanting to question the positions we're in as Australians. And if it's the last thing we do on the lands of the Gadigal, I'd just like to say Namangamanir Talinaranga Panji Jaminka Daklianiao. I hope one day you can all learn that, because that simply says thank you because we extend our hand in friendship. So go well, and thank you.